Today I'm going to be speaking with David Livingstone Smith, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of New England in Maine and also author of the book On Inhumanity, Dehumanization, and How to Resist It. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, David.
So, to set the stage for the conversation, when we talk about dehumanization and inhumanity, there are a lot of ways that we could sort of define those ideas, but what do you mean when you talk about that?
Well, dehumanization is a word that's used in so many different ways. I mean, even in the scholarly literature. What I mean by dehumanization is the attitude of conceiving of other people as subhuman creatures.
And in history, there are so many different examples of when we can say that this dehumanization took place. There are times where it can take place by people who are trying to justify horrible acts of violence. There are times when dehumanization might even be a coping mechanism by someone exposed to extremely harsh or difficult conditions in some way, shape, or form. What are some of the different ways that in human history this has manifested?
Well, almost always, dehumanization is the product of propaganda. So it's not something that spontaneously arises in the human mind. Rather, it's the result of people in positions of power who want us to do terrible things to one another. And the paradigmatic example of that is genocide. So if those in power, those who are in positions of authority, can convince us that these others, that they wish us to harm, are dangerous, toxic, subhuman creatures that we must destroy in our own self-defense, then that allows us to overcome a very natural resistance human beings have to doing awful things to one another.
I'm thinking of so many of the books I've read about the Holocaust and concentration camps and the way in which concentration camp guards, SS, Nazi soldiers, etc., by propaganda, I mean, quite literally, the story that Hitler was telling about Jews and about some others was about these people are not really human the way we are. But there's also, interestingly, in some of the memoirs of survivors of concentration camps, they said they also experienced a sort of dehumanization even of their peers, which they saw almost as a survival instinct, which is that a different mechanism?
Well, yes, we'd have to go into some detail about what they had in mind, but
Yeah.
certainly people who are the victims of dehumanization are quite aware generally that they're seen as subhuman creatures. I mean, we find this in the example of the Holocaust. I mean, the two examples that I use most in my work are the Holocaust, which, by the way, has centuries old roots in European anti-Semitism.
Yep.
Jews had been dehumanized since the 12th century in Europe, and also the brutal oppression of Black people in the United States, particularly in the aftermath of the American Civil War. And in both those instances, the victims of dehumanization were well aware that they were seen as subhuman creatures, monsters, demons, vermin.
As a historical note, Uh, what is I'm curious whether you're aware of, I know of anti-Semitism based in the idea of Jews bringing the plague.
Mhm.
And I don't remember if that's 13th century or 14th century. Is that the earliest example you're aware of, or is there something prior to that?
Well, dehumanization of Jews, we find it sporadically earlier. So in the Gospel of John, Jews are described as offspring of Satan,
Mm,
right? So that's a very early Christian uh, root of some anti-Semitic ideas, right? So if you're the offspring of Satan, you're demonic.
yes.
This idea of the demonic Jew persisted, but it really took a terrible turn during the First Crusade, when Christians marched off to the Holy Land to win it back from the infidel, and along the way, they decided to attack the infidel in their midst. Remember, Jews were the only religious minority who were permitted to survive in Europe.
Right.
Um, and it's from this point onward that Jews are racialized. They're seen as an alien and inferior race and seen as demonic, devilish, biologically different even. It was believed that Jewish men menstruated, that Jews had horns and tails and so on. And so it just picks up there. And then after the bubonic plague of the mid 14th century, it gets really, really, really bad.
When it comes to the, I guess we would, the dehumanizers, so to speak, sometimes words or terms like they are monsters, they are animals, etc., are applied, which is, in a sense, is a dehumanization of the dehumanizers. Is that something we should be concerned about doing? Are there risks to doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. We should be concerned about that. Monsters are fictional. No one is a monster. Hitler was not a monster. I'm Jewish, I can say that. Hitler was not a monster. Goebbels was not a monster. These are human beings. And it would really benefit us if we considered them as holding up a mirror to what is possible for any human being. You know, we are all vulnerable. There's no vaccination against dehumanizing attitudes.
Is the term dehumanization relevant to, I'm thinking back a few months now during the coronavirus pandemic, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, gave this viral interview, I think it was on Fox News, where he said something about, listen, I would be willing to sacrifice myself. I think grandma, or so to speak, something like that. They're willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of the economy, by which he really meant the stock market. Is that a sort of dehumanization that we've seen during coronavirus of when you see a number, 4,000 died or 3,000 died, and you just sat in your house and worked from home? It doesn't really feel that difference of 1,000. You don't feel it in any real way. It seems like that's a form of dehumanization.
Some people would call it dehumanization. I prefer a very fine-grained notion of what dehumanization is. So there are a bunch of related attitudes, but you see, I think if we're to understand what I consider the most toxic form of these attitudes, which I reserve the term dehumanization for, we need to get a good understanding of how it works. Otherwise, we don't have a chance in hell of dismantling it. Right? So I would call that callousness. And of course, what he's saying, in fact, is he's willing to sacrifice the life of grandma.
Right.
Grandma isn't speaking there.
Are there things you've observed during the pandemic that you would apply the term dehumanization to?
Oh, yes. So what's gone on in this pandemic, as is typical, by the way, of earlier pandemics, is xenophobia. So the pandemic is blamed on others, racial others, because race and dehumanization are very closely tied together. And then when you start talking about people as diseased, as dangerous outsiders, you are either well on the way towards dehumanization or actually there. You see, it's not regarded as especially acceptable to call people demons and monsters anymore. So we have substitute terms. They're diseased, they're criminal, they're dangerous, they're bad to the bone. And what we get in this pandemic and in previous pandemics is an upsurge in that kind of feeling, which has historically led to all sorts of horrible things.
It seems as though the rhetoric of dehumanization probably has some specific overlap with authoritarian regimes and authoritarianism. Is it? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So there are two ways that, but I think the first question to address is why dehumanization in the first place? And the reason, I believe, is that human beings, being highly social animals, have difficulty performing acts of lethal or even sublethal violence on one another. We're just equipped with these inhibitions. But those are very inconvenient if you want to oppress and exterminate others. So, as I said, people in positions of power, of authority, can tell us, you know, these others, they might look like you and me, they might look like human beings, but really deep down where it counts on the inside, they're something else. And that is absolutely typical of authoritarian going on fascist
If
propaganda.
it seems almost like a tool that's necessary for such a regime to advance its propaganda to you talked about the role of propaganda in dehumanization earlier. It seems that for authoritarian regimes, that dehumanization of the other is necessary for them to advance their goals.
It's certainly extremely helpful. I would say maybe near necessary.
Mm.
I hesitate to say anything is necessary, but it is certainly helpful. Sometimes the dehumanizing ideology is distributed through a community. So as I say in the first chapter of On in Humanity, I grew up in the Deep South in the 50s and 60s, and their dehumanizing attitudes towards Black people, that was in the air you breathe. You
Right.
didn't need a Rush Limbaugh, say, to propagate these things.
How casual was the dehumanization when you were growing up in the South?
Oh, it was just as, we would say the sky is up and the earth is down. Black people who were not referred to by that word, by
Sure.
the way, were seen as filthy, subhuman animals. I mean, that was kids in my high school would brag about hunting Black kids with their BB guns on weekends for sport.
Mm. That's and do you what was there a gradual transition out of that aligned with the Civil Rights era, 1964 Civil Rights Act? Did it lag that?
There's a gradual transition, but also a reentrenchment. I mean,
Mm.
these things have not gone away still, right? We like to think about the New South, but these things take a very, very, very long time to change, right? They do not disappear quickly. They can remain latent, relatively invisible for a long period of time. And then the social environment changes a little bit. Someone in power, like our former president, gives permission for certain kinds of attitudes, and bang, the Confederate flags are out.
Where do things like eugenics and phrenology play into this? Because on the one hand, stuff about measuring skull ratios and all this stuff, in a sense, it's very human in that we're looking at the minutia of the characteristics of the human form, but its use seems to be dehumanizing.
Well, it's actually a bit worse than that. So if we look at the history of scientific racism in the United States,
Yeah.
during the period when these practices were beginning to flourish, eugenics is a bit later, but certainly the skull measurement work, the premier scientific authorities in the country described Black people as literally another species.
Hmm.
There were learned papers on this, and mixed race people were seen as literally as hybrids between different species. So you see there, the dehumanizing attitude is endorsed by scientific authority. It could be scientific authority, it could be political authority. It's anyone who has that kind of influence.
Right. Yeah, I mean that makes, and I know you write about this in the book. It brings me to the topic of climate change and climate science.
Yeah.
What do you see? Maybe to the audience, it's not obvious the connection between dehumanization, the way we've talked about in authoritarian regimes and so on, and the connection to climate change.
Yeah. Well, the aspect of climate change that's most salient for me in my work on dehumanization is that I think catastrophic climate change, which I don't think anyone's going to do anything about. I think we're well too late for that, and there's insufficient motivation, despite the fine words that are said, is going to create a situation which is a perfect storm for really dangerous forms of dehumanization.
Hmm.
There will be refugee problems like the world has never known. When the population of Bangladesh spills into India, and resources run short and infrastructures break down, This is going to generate intense xenophobia, and I would put good money on dehumanizing rhetoric of the worst, most genocidal sort.
Is the only way to prevent it to prevent the climate refugees from becoming refugees? I mean, is if that happens, is there
Yeah,
really any way to prevent what you're describing?
I'd like to know, and I'd like to think that there is.
Yeah.
We're human beings. We can change our behavior, but we have to know about it. We have to be aware of it. We have to be vigilant, and there have to be policies in place to help us. And I just don't think we're awake enough to the possibilities to take the sorts of steps which will be necessary. That's one reason I wrote the book. Right? Dehumanization is an ongoing problem, and to do something about it, we have to understand it. We have to understand how it works, why we are all vulnerable to dehumanizing propaganda, and what steps we might be able to take to at least constrain it.
The book is on inhumanity, dehumanization, and how to resist it. We've been speaking with the book's author, Professor David Livingstone Smith, an important topic, and I appreciate you joining me to talk about it today.
I appreciate you inviting me.